All right, so we're going to talk a little about graphing trig functions. So when we're graphing trig functions, there's a couple things that we need to identify on the graphs. So the first thing you want to look at, I'm going to make an X and Y coordinate. Actually, I'm going to do it in dark blue. So the first thing you want to do is identify the period. And your period is how long it takes for your function to start repeating. So I'm going to go back and look at our unit circle for a second. So on our unit circle, how long does it take for our circle to start repeating is 360 degrees or 2 pi. So when we graph sine, remember sine is our y values. So how long it takes for these values, and I just wrote a couple of the points and not all of them, is 2 pi, because then it's going around the circle again. So here, for y equals sine of x, our period is going to be 2 pi. Now when we graph this, we are going to, you can graph every single point on the unit circle, but remember this is 1/2 square root of 2 over 2, square root of 3 over 2. It is really hard to graph some of these functions. So what we're going to focus on is our 4 nice pretty points. So I'm going to graph 4 points on here. Okay, I'm going to graph at 0, at pi over 2 or 90 degrees, at pi or 180 degrees, at 3 pi over 2 or 270 degrees, and then back at 362 pi. So notice there are 4 nice pretty points here. So our increments that we're going to graph, so on our x-axis, our dashes, we're going to take our period and we're going to divide it by 4 every single time. We're always going to divide by 4 because we have 4 nice pretty points on our unit circle. 1, 2, 3, 4. So here when we take 2 pi and divide this by 4, we get pi over 2. And yes, we could do this in degrees as well. I think it's harder to do it in radians, so I'm going to teach you radians, so that way when we do degrees, it'll be easier. So that means each one of these increments, we have 4 increments, each one of these is going to have a distance of pi over 2. So this will be pi over 2. This will be 2 pi over 2, which will be pi, 3 pi over 2, and then 4 pi over 2, which is just 2 pi. And notice these are nice pretty ones. I'm also going to do the negative direction as well. All right, so now we have our x-axis figured out. Our y-axis is going to be our biggest and our smallest values of sine. So remember, sine is the y values. So I go from 0 to 1 to 0 to -1. So really all I'm going to need on here is 1 and -1. So I'm going to graph. So at 0, if I look at my unit circle, at 0 radians, sine is 0. At pi over 2 radians, my sine is 1. So at pi over 2, this is 1. At pi radians, sine is 0. At 3 pi over 2 radians, sine is -1. And then at 2 pi, sine is 0 again. And then it's just going to repeat on. So if I connect these points, this is what my sine graph or my sine wave looks like. Now if I'm going in the opposite direction here, so it follows this nice pretty pattern, it's going to repeat this pattern over and over and over. It's going to go on forever, depending on how many times we go around our unit circle. So if we go the opposite way, it's got to continue this pattern. So notice once you kind of get the first one, you can just kind of follow the curve to get the other points. And if you wanted to check any of these values, if you stuck them in your calculator, you'd have to change your calculator to radian degrees, but it should give you this graph. So we need to find our amplitude. Our amplitude is how far it comes off the middle. So here our amplitude equals 1. And you can see it comes down 1 as well. This line in the middle of our graph is our midline. It's the middle of our graph, and it tells us our vertical shift. So if our midline was, say, we were going up 2, our midline would be at 2. And our horizontal shift right now, or our phase shift, we don't have any currently. When we get to one of the graphs, I will show you what it looks like. All right, so now we're going to graph cosine. So cosine is done very similar to sine. So let's set up our curve. Now our period, cosine, is our x values. Okay, so just like sine, they take 2 pi to go around. So here our period for this is 2 pi. Which means our increments, which are always our period divided by 4. So this is 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2. So the increments on our graph, this should be pi over 2. This should be pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. And then we have the negative ones as well. So now let's graph this. I will graph cosine in, let's do yellow. All right, so now cosine is our x values. So here at 0 radians, it's at 1. So let's get our 1 and negative 1 here. So at 0, it's at 1. At pi over 2, it's at 0. At pi, it's at negative 1. At 3 pi over 2, it's at 0. And at 2 pi, it's at 1. So let's connect these points. So here's our cosine graph. So now, again, this is going to make this same shape over and over and over again. It's going to look very similar to sine. Just their starting points are different. So if I was to continue this graph, again, each increment's going to be one of our pretty points, and we just kind of follow along. If it's at the top, it's going to go to the middle. If that's in the middle, it's going to continue down, and it's going to go back up. And again, our midline here. And then our amplitude. Here is 1. So now, how can these numbers change, or how can our graph change if our equation changes? Now, your amplitude when looking at this graph is the number in front. This is 1 cosine of theta, or 1 sine of theta. Your midline, how that shifts, remember up and down, It's adding on the outside, so this is adding. This is a plus 0 on the outside, which is why our midline is at 0. So we're going to take a look at some of the cases where it's going to change. I'm going to break this into 2 notes so it doesn't get too long. So we'll probably do another 3 on here and do the rest on the next set of notes. All right, so let's look at y equals 3 cosine of theta. Oh, let's go back for a sec. An important distinction between these two. So how do we know the difference between these two without having to go back and look at our unit circle every time? Sine starts on the midline. So sine is going to start on the midline. We started here. Cosine is going to start above or below the midline. It's going to start above if it's a positive. It'll start below if it's a negative. If sine is negative, it's still going to start here, but instead of going up first, it'll go down first. So I'm going to write that at the top. Sine starts on the midline. Cosine starts above or below. All right. So here we go. Our period. So cosine, we haven't really changed anything. Still takes 2 pi to go around. So my increments are going to be 2 pi, or period, divided by 4. So this is pi over 2. So again, this part hasn't changed. So pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi, negative pi over 2, negative pi, negative 3 pi over 2, negative 2 pi. And then, let's see, our next step, our amplitude. So notice here, our amplitude is 3. So this is our amplitude. That means I'm going to be going up 3 and down 3. My midline is at 0 because I'm not adding or subtracting anything. So here's my midline. So this means all of my points on this graph are going to be at either 0, positive 3, or negative 3. Okay, at my midline, plus 3 from my midline, and minus 3 from my midline. So cosine, again, starts above or below. Since this is a positive cosine, it's going to start above. So we're going to start above. And then when we follow our pattern, if we're at the top, then at our next increment over, we have to go to the middle. And then our next increment over, we have to go to the bottom. And then our next increment over, we have to go to the middle. And then our next increment over, we have to go to the top. So then I continue it on the other side. Now it is worth noting that these are cosine waves and sine waves. They're nice smooth curves. They're not mountains. They're not pointy. And here this is the graph. All right, 4. So let's get our, I'll sketch it on this side. So our period hasn't changed. Our period is 2 pi, which means our increments are going to be pi over 2 because it's our period divided by 4. So this will be pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi. And then we can go the other way as well. Now here, our amplitude is 2. So that means I'm going to be going up 2 and down 2. And my midline, I should have really done that first, is at 0. So this means all of my values are going to be at my midline of 0, plus 2 from my midline, so at 2, and minus 2 from my midline, so at negative 2. So when I graph sine starts on the midline. So I'm going to start on the midline. Now because it's a negative, this means instead of going up, I'm going to go down for my first increment. So when I go to pi over 2, I'm going to go down 2. And then I'm going to go back up 2 to my midline, and then to the top, and then back to the midline. And then to get the other half, go back around. So now, on one of your homeworks, it's going to say graph 2 cycles. Your cycle is just one piece of it, one full rotation. Okay, so graphing 2 cycles, if we do it in the negative direction, if you do 1 period and 1 period, you're always going to graph 2 cycles, which is why we're doing it this way. When it asks, like here, if it asks for vertical shift, I think on the directions over here, it says, yeah, your vertical shift and your phase shift. If you didn't have any, you would just put 0 or none. All right, we'll do 5, and then this will be the last one for these notes. So here, our period is still going to be 2 pi. And my increments are my period divided by 2, so this is still pi over, or excuse me, my period divided by 4, so this is still pi over 2. All right, now here, my midline, or my vertical shift, is at 3. So this is going to be the middle of my graph that I make. Is going to be at 3. My amplitude is 2, which means I'm going to go up 2 and down 2 from my midline. So I'm going to go down to 1 and up to 5. So all of the points that I'm going to make on my y are either going to be at 1, at 3, or at 5. So sine starts on the midline. So when I go to 0, I'm going to start on the midline. Since it's a positive sign, as I go over 1 increment to pi over 2, I'm going to go up to 5. Then when I'm at the top, I go to the midline. And then I'm going to go down my amplitude to 1. And then back to the midline. Okay, notice this graph never goes back down to my x-axis, okay? It doesn't go up, below. It's literally your midline and then your amplitude up and your amplitude down. So I continue it on the other side. So I have to make it a nice, smooth, repeating curve. All right, so that'll be all for these notes. We'll finish up the other, I think there's 12 problems on here. So we will do the other 7 the next notes day, and then I think I have a worksheet with 6 problems, and that'll round off the week.